But what I wanted to talk about today was self-interest, and what does self-interest mean? And I'll just read the few paragraphs that I'd sent out to everybody. The Black writer, educator, and activist Ibram Kendi wrote that the roots of white supremacy is self-interest. I mean, I read an article by him. He said he doesn't believe it's hatred. He thinks it's self-interest. And it's self-interest also that drove the rioters who stormed the Capitol building on January 6th. And Trump's numerous lies arose from his self-interest. And anyone who supports him does so out of self-interest. But the far right and conservatives do not have a lock on self-interest. It also appears on the left and in the middle. I just wanted to mention, I just recently read an article about QAnon and some of their beliefs. I think on CNN, Anderson Cooper is interviewing somebody who told him that they believed that Anderson Cooper killed babies and drank their blood. That's what they taught them in QAnon. And of course, the Democrats ran a pedophile ring in the basement of a pizza parlor, and also they, would butcher children and drink their blood. And so, where does the self-interest come in there? It's just amazingly so far removed from reality. And some of the people who were storming the Capitol building, wanted to find Nancy Pelosi and put a bullet in her head, because they believed this stuff. So, I have a little bit of knowledge, about how these people are recruited. So often they're people who feel unaffiliated with anything, and these groups bring them in and make them feel comfortable and feed them this stuff. But from a Zen perspective, we say that when one's self-interest is the same as a communal interest, then our Dharma relations become complete. And I gave a small example of a farmer whose corn always took the first prize at the state fair, and he had a habit of sharing his best corn seed with all the farmers in the neighborhood. And when asked why, he said, "It's really a matter of self-interest. The wind picks up the pollen and carries it from the field to field. So if my neighbors grow inferior corn, the cross-pollination brings down the quality of my corn. That's why I'm concerned that they plant only the very best." So also from another perspective of our Zen practice is that the deeper we get into it, the more clearly we see that we're all one body. So our own self-interest is the interest of the one body, which is the totality of everybody and everything. Like Bernie Glassman likes to use the example of your two hands. He called them Fred and Pete. So if suppose Fred squeezes his finger in the door or puts himself down on a hot stove and gets burned, Pete over here isn't going to say, "Hey man, that's your problem, dude." No, he would, do whatever he could to help pull that hand away from the injury or the harm. And if we take that analogy and broaden it out, what does it mean about all of life? How do we best serve all of life? But then, of course, in our practice, there's another level because the notion of self is just that, a notion. So the Buddha realized and taught that there is no independent abiding self. So what self is it that's being protected and aggrandized through self-interest? The practice of Zen is to realize the oneness and interconnectedness of life. And in that realization, there's no room for an independent self, an independent, a self that's independent of everything else. So what does that mean, in terms of, I was talking with one of you today about, there are real dangers in the world. So when there are cancers in the body, we have to take care of it. We have to heal it. There's ways to protect ourselves. And in a tree that has a diseased limb, we have to prune it. But how do we do it in a way? How some of these QAnon people, some of them, realized the propaganda, it wasn't really serving them. But there's a lot of incredible ignorance, and it's not just intellectual or conceptual knowledge that people need. People need to really understand the whole body experience, what they're doing is causing problems. But somehow they feel threatened. But if we realize there is no self, then we realize the oneness. Because it's this independent, unique self that prevents us from realizing that. If you could bear with me for a couple more minutes, I want to talk about Nagarjuna, who's considered to be one of the most eminent Buddhist thinkers. And he's also an ancestor in our lineage. Those of you who had Jukai in our lineage, if you look on your lineage chart, Nagarjuna's name is there. And he lived in the 2nd and 3rd century of the Christian era. And his philosophy was called Madhyamaka, and it's based on the Prajnaparamita literature, which the Heart Sutra, which we chanted this morning, is part of that literature. And based on his experience, Nagarjuna argued that everything arises dependent upon everything else. So nothing has an independent existence. And the technical Buddhist term is codependent origination. And the reason that everything is empty, nothing has a fixed nature, it's because it depends on everything else. And I'm actually going to give you Nagarjuna's argument, his philosophical argument, which hopefully won't be too abstruse and make your head spin. So he said, if subjects and their objects and things and their attributes and causes and their effects exist independently, as we habitually take them to, then they must not be dependent on any kind of condition or relation. See? If things are independent, they don't depend on anything else. This point basically amounts to a philosophical insistence of the meaning of independent, intrinsic, and absolute. So something is independent, intrinsic, or absolute only if it does not depend on anything else. It must have an identity that transcends its relationships. Okay, is that clear? So, and then Nagarjuna said, there's nothing in our experience that can be found that satisfies this criterion of independence or ultimacy. Nothing can be found apart from the conditions of arising, formation, and decay. Codependent co-arising, dependent co-arising. Everything arises depending on conditions, and everything arises, exists, and then decays. And in our modern context, this points to a rather obvious when considering the causes and conditions of the material world. But Nagarjuna took the understanding of codependence considerably further. Causes and their effects, things and their attributes, the very mind of the inquiring subject or person, and the objects of the mind are each equally codependent on the other. Nagarjuna's logic addresses itself penetratingly to the mind of the inquiring subject, or the person, to the ways in which what are actually codependent factors are taken by the subject to be ultimate founding blocks of the supposed objective and supposed subjective reality. So he's saying that when we observe things, we think that they're independent and objective and external and internal. When I studied the physics, one of the principles of Heisenberg, uncertainty principle. So when you, as an observer, essentially one way of putting it is that when you observe something, you change the thing by the mere act of observing it. So that's, in a way, this is like a macro Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Everything is interrelated. So therefore, this is a conclusion that Nagarjuna drew. Nothing can be found that has an ultimate or independent existence. Or in our Buddhist language, everything is empty of an independent existence, for it is codependently originated and is impermanent because it depends on the conditions. So when we talk about our practice, our mission, if we choose to accept it, is to reveal and embrace this codependent origination, which also you can say is the groundlessness of our being. There's nothing fixed. And this is, of course, the first tenet of not knowing. So some of you have heard me say many times that one of the aims of our Zen practice is to learn to be comfortable with not knowing. You know, how to be comfortable where everything is groundless. It's constantly changing and impermanent. So how can we find satisfaction and happiness in this groundlessness? And bringing it back to the topic about self-interest, I said that when our self-interest and the interest of the one body are the same, you know, then our Dharma relations are complete. But if we look at it carefully, you know, we can all see that we all have our unique life experience, you know, all of the events that have happened in our life which help form us, and we all hold on to it in different ways. So how can we experience this no self-interest as the self-interest of the one body? So that's kind of the theme today, and I got a little philosophical, which I usually don't do, but I thought it might give us some grist for the mill here. So